Thank you, choir and Kim, Carol. The most predictable way to preach a sermon on the second commandment would probably be to first note the prohibition against making idols to worship, and then to go on to say that even though you and I don't craft for ourselves things that we bow down to and worship, we nonetheless do have a tendency to give certain things in our lives at times far more authority, far more of our time and attention and energy than is warranted. Seen that way, every one of us probably has an idol or two that sometimes sneaks into our lives every so often. For some folks, their implicit idol is sports, evoking from them sometimes more energy and attention and time than their families, their jobs, their church, their God, giving credence to comedian Dave Barry's observation that it is puzzling how some grown men who can't remember which one of their children has asthma can nonetheless become deeply agonized for 17 weeks out of the year over a complete stranger's hamstring problem. For others, the idol that they sometimes find camped out in their psyches is what can become the idol of self-care. That sometimes insidious shibboleth of our age, an idea when taken to its extreme form is neither biblical nor ethical. For that extreme form is that you always ought to look out for number one, first and foremost, and that therefore purchases, say, of the newest electronics or those smelly bath salts or those season tickets, well, those need no justification, whether you can afford them or not, because you're simply taking care of yourself. So predictable or not, it is indeed true that each of us is prone to making idols that we sometimes do give more attention, even ultimate attention to, than is warranted. Each of us is indeed prone to fitting the definition of idolatry that one preacher gives, quote, "Idolatry is the practice of ascribing absolute value to things of relative worth." However, what I am more interested in this morning is why and how that happens. And to think about that, we need to take a closer look at the first line of the second commandment, and in particular, the word that is translated as idol. Now, this word can be just as accurately translated as image. And about half of the translations I consulted do so. And while translating it that way has sometimes led to awful excesses, such as when during the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, all kinds of Catholic art in Catholic churches was destroyed, there is something nonetheless very important about this linkage between images and idols. For you see, while it is important, in fact, it's crucial to use our words well to describe who God is and what God is like, images are also crucial. And I dare say that every one of us has an image, a picture of God in our minds that can color our thinking and our actions, and which can lead indeed to giving something power if we have a false image of God. Giving something power that never should have had that power, and which can thereby cause much misery. Some of you may have heard the story about the little girl who was drawing a picture and someone inquired of her what she was drawing. She said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the person responded, "Well, honey, you can't do that." She said, "Why not?" "Well, no one knows what God looks like." The little girl then said, "Well, they will when I'm finished." We may not know what God looks like, but I have no doubt whatsoever that all of us carry an image, a picture or two of God in our minds, and it is when we give power over to some of those images, power that they don't deserve, that we make an idol. What picture of God is in your mind? What pictures have you observed that others seem to have? Well, I am haunted to this day by a woman in my church in Hawaii who was one of the most generous and loving people I have ever known, and who died painfully and much too young, and even on her deathbed kept saying to me, "I know I did something to deserve this." You see, the picture, the image of God in her mind was of a karmic scorekeeper who sent her cancer for some secret sin that was just too strongly etched. That idea was just too strongly etched for her to overcome. And I am frustrated by the people whose picture of God is one that looks far more like a painting of their political party or their ideologies than anything else, who, if they are on the left, seem to portray God as the honorary chair of the ACLU, and if they are on the right, appear to depict God sometimes as the spokesperson for the NRA. And I shake my head at those folks whose picture of God is one of God as their very own personal lucky charm, getting them parking places and out of speeding tickets and making sure that they and theirs are safe, and who thereby never think through the hard questions of what it means with such a picture that God keeps their families safe but doesn't apparently care so much for other families. And I am enraged at the picture of God that is apparently in the mind of a very well-known para-church organization leader who more than once has been quoted as saying that women in abusive relationships should put up with getting slapped around for a night and then not call the police the next day, but to call their pastor. Too many of whom have then told the woman that God wants them to stay in that relationship no matter at what cost to them or their children, because the man is always right, because he's the head of the household. Pictures can be powerful, can't they? Particularly when they're unacknowledged, and can cause an idol to be created that looks far more like our own fears and failings, our own xenophobias and zealotries, our own meanness and muddledness, our own bigotries and biases than they do of the God who sent his only Son that everyone might have life abundantly, and who wishes that no one would perish. The story of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments picks back up a few chapters later in Exodus, when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai carrying those two tablets on which the commandments are chiseled. And he finds that in his absence, his brother Aaron and the people have been overcome by their fear and their worry and have taken all the gold jewelry and melted it down and fashioned it into a golden calf to worship. Now, what's fascinating to me about this story is not so much that these folks, tired and scared and weary, would give in to their fears. Hasn't each one of us done that at times? No, what fascinates me is that the item that they fashioned was not an alternative God, but was rather, in fact, meant to be an image of Yahweh. If you read that chapter in Exodus carefully, you realize they're not making a whole new God, they're making a picture, an image of Yahweh. They didn't switch gods. They didn't create a substitute God. No, they simply couldn't stand not to have an image, a representation, a picture, if you will, of God. But they got the picture wrong. They got it wrong. And so they created Yahweh in the image of one of those Egyptian deities, one of those gods that had been enmeshed in a system that had thrived on hatred and oppression and abuse and fear. They got the picture of Yahweh wrong because they returned, in fashioning that calf, they returned to the assumptions and the understandings about God that would not give them life, but death and hurt. The assumptions about God that they learned there in Egypt. For you see, to use the fancy psychological word, they'd been part of a system of violence and cruelty and capriciousness for so long that they had internalized these things and these assumptions. And so their God, too, they thought, they pictured, must also be violent, cruel, and capricious. And friends, what happens? What follows when that happens? Well, the Hebrew people wandered their way for 40 more years, seeking to purge that picture from their minds and their hearts. For that's the truth that lies in the second part of this commandment. Indeed, the wrongful pictures that we carry around about ourselves and our world and about God can do damage for generation after generation. And indeed, the sins and the shortcomings and the tragedies of one generation thereby live on into the next and the next and the next. For example, and as we have yet again seen in the news just this week, we all know that children who are abused emotionally, physically, sexually will very often replicate that behavior with their children. And men who see their fathers beat their mothers will too often recreate what they learned. And we all know, as a society, we know that 250 years of slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow have replicated for generation after generation a people whose net worth is only a fraction of those whose forebearers weren't enslaved, to the diminishment of everyone in this nation. And we all know that two of the most crucial predictive factors for the recurrence of juvenile delinquency over the generations are poverty and dropping out of school. And yet too often we have only sought to punish the results, like the indisputably horrific results from illegal drugs, instead of also giving anywhere near the time, attention, and creativity to the causes. And so the awful and soul-stultifying pictures get painted and repainted, and the sins of one generation indeed are passed on and created anew. At this point, though, we have to ask, where in all of this is the good news? The gospel. Where is the hope? Well, it lies in precisely three things. First, as the words of the commandment say, while the effects of the wrong pictures about life, world, and God can indeed persist and perdure into new generations, notice as well that the commandment affirms with this outrageous number, 1,000, that God's work and power and patient persistence to bring good out of evil never, ever ends, never stops. 1,000 ages in thy sight. And second, we can affirm this morning that it is not, in fact, God who visits these evils, but God is the one who seeks to undo them, transcend them, redeem them. As our reading from the Gospel of John notes, Jesus himself dismissed the idea that man's blindness was caused by his or his parents' sins, and instead simply affirmed that in the face of any evil, God is nonetheless always at work. For as James put it, the Apostle James put it in our other reading, God does not put evil in anyone's way. Third, how many of you have ever played with an Etch-a-Sketch? How many of you have ever picked up your or your children's or your grandchildren's Etch-a-Sketch after it had been sitting up on a shelf for a long time? Do you remember what happens? You shake it. You shake it again, and the picture that was made by whoever used it last is still there. So you shake it again and yet again and yet again, and each time a little more of that old hardened-on picture from ages ago dissolves until finally you have a blank screen staring at you. And then you can begin to make your own picture, not determined, not foreordained by the picture that was there before. My friends, hear this. God this morning is helping you to both shake the etch-a-sketch of your life and to redraw the picture that is there. God doesn't want to be trapped by images that don't display amazing grace and unwavering love, and God doesn't want you trapped by pictures of life, of world, of God that are hurtful or hateful. Is that an easy thing to do? No. Oh my, no. It's a very hard thing to correct or erase the pictures that have trapped you and hurt you, to overcome the habits and the patterns that have been passed on to you through the generations. But it is possible. It is possible. How? Well, do you feel right now? Do you feel God's hand enfolding yours as you hold on to that knob on the etch-a-sketch of your life? And do you hear God saying to you, my child, no, no, no. Draw it like this. Draw it like this.